we're talking about the respiratory system, we're going to start with what the overall major role of this system is. And so the respiratory system, the major role of it is to be able to supply the body with all of the gases that it needs. The main gas is going to be, of course, our O2 supply or our oxygen. This is our primary gas that our body will actually need. But while we're also going to supply the body with gases, another part of the major role of the respiratory system will be to dispose of any gas waste. And so the main gas that is our waste gas will be CO2, otherwise known as carbon dioxide. Make sure you're doing the di. Carbon monoxide is poisonous and is a totally different chemical. So we've got O2 and we've got CO2. So we've got our primary gas that our body needs to get around our body, and then we need to dispose of the effects of cellular respiration, which is going to be mainly CO2, and we need to be able to get rid of that. So it's a 4-step process to the sequence of respiration. So with respiration, when we are talking about this, to kind of put us all on the same page, there is 4 steps for the respiration process, or the process of respiration. The first step is going to be called pulmonary ventilation. So in pulmonary ventilation, think about the word pulmonary, we're going to be in the lungs. This is where you will have your air going into the lungs. So you are essentially bringing air from the outside of the body into the lungs, and then as it travels through the lungs, it will go through all of the alveoli. The second half of this chapter, or this exercise, we're going to go through all the structures of the respiratory system, but first, lungs and alveoli is taking air into our body. Another way to think about this is when you think about the term ventilation, this essentially is synonymous with when we say we're breathing. So you can kind of put those two thoughts together. Pulmonary ventilation is we are taking in air, we're breathing. The second step of respiration is going to be external respiration. So external respiration. This part of the process is going to be a gas exchange. And we are going to be exchanging gases between 2 places. So it will be between the air that we have just breathed in and the blood. So this will take place in our lungs. So when we are exchanging gas, essentially what we mean is we are going from the air and we are passing this O2 from our air into our bloodstream. So this is how we are taking in air into our blood. We are going through the process of external respiration. When you think about respiration, the key that you should think about is going to be unloading. So with respiration, what is happening is we are doing O2 loading into our blood, but we're also going to be doing CO2 unloading. We're getting rid of that carbon dioxide that's attached to our blood. We're going to go through more of this in a minute. So we've got pulmonary ventilation, which essentially is our breathing in air. We've got external respiration, where after we've breathed the air into our lungs, then it is going to go across the cells in our lungs and get absorbed into our bloodstream. So at this point, we are now in our blood, but we're still in our lungs. So then our step 3 of respiration is going to be the transport piece. So it's the transport of respiratory gases. So we are now taking this gas that we have just put into our blood, the oxygen. We've loaded the oxygen into our blood, and now we have to transport the gas throughout the entire body. So with this transportation, what we are essentially doing is supplying the body with gas. And this is happening through the movement of the blood. So this is what the cardiovascular system was responsible for doing. So this is where they play in a lot. So as we pump the blood around our body, that blood is carrying our gas. It's either carrying oxygen or it's carrying carbon dioxide, but either way, we're transporting that respiratory gas throughout the body. And then we've got step 4, is you're going to do a process called internal respiration. So remember when we were up here and we talked about external respiration, it was a gas exchange between the air and the blood in our lungs, and we were doing a loading and an unloading. We were loading in O2 because we just unloaded CO2. So keep that in mind because this was external respiration. Now this is going to be internal respiration. So internal respiration is going to be the same thing. It is a gas exchange because respiration means gas exchange. So what we're exchanging here is not going to be between air and our lungs. It is going to be between the blood and our tissues. So the blood has traveled through the body through the transport of respiratory gases. And when we get down to internal respiration, that blood that has traveled from our heart to the tips of our toes needs to somehow get from the vessel in our tips of our toes into the actual connective tissue and muscles and bones that is in the tips of our toes. So that internal respiration is going to be the gas exchange between the blood and wherever tissue it needed to go. And this is again going to be a gas what did I call it up here? Unloading and loading. So this respiration, what we are doing here is we are again doing oxygen, carbon dioxide. But at this point, we are doing oxygen unloading, and that oxygen is going to our tissue. But what we are loading into our blood cells is going to be CO2 because this is going to now be our waste. So that kind of puts it into perspective of this 4-step process. So when we're looking at 1 through 4, there's going to be kind of a theme that they follow through. We're going to talk about that in a quick second. But one thing I want to note is when we're looking at steps 1 and 2, so we're doing pulmonary ventilation and external respiration. At these particular points, we are only talking about the respiratory system. We have essentially only talked about the structure of the lung and then being able to get the gas from our lungs into our blood. But that's still just respiratory system. Once you get down to the transport and then internal respiration, this is where you are going to have your respiratory system as well, because we are in this system, but it is going to be combined with the cardiovascular system. So technically, you cannot have a healthy respiratory system without a healthy cardiovascular system because we will need that system to pump the blood throughout the body. Okay, so these are our 4 steps. To kind of break it down a little bit further, what I like to do is kind of follow a breath. So kind of like we did in the cardiovascular system, we followed a drop of blood through the heart. I find it really helpful to draw essentially breath and to see what happens when we do what and follow this 4-step sequence. So we're going to start with the process of inhalation. We are taking in a very deep breath. When we are taking in a deep breath, we are going to have our O2 gas that is out here in the air, and that O2 gas will come down into our mouth. This is our mouth essentially, down into our throat, down into our lungs. So with the process of inhalation, we are taking the oxygen that is in the air and bringing it into our body, specifically into our lungs. if that makes sense. So just to make it a little bit more clear, we're going to do this. This is the process of oxygen coming into our body from the air to our lungs. That's step one. So we're going to take in the air. Then what we're going to do is we're going to take that oxygen, and it is going from our lungs, and we are going to follow a process where the O2, here we go, sorry. The O2 will actually diffuse from the alveoli into our blood. So we've got that oxygen in our lungs. We're going to have the O2 essentially will go from our air, which is in our alveoli, and it will transfer and go into our blood. So this is the process that will follow. And then what happens after this? We then have our O2, and it will actually travel. And what it will travel in is it will travel in the blood. And where it is headed is to all of the tissues of our body, wherever it needs to go. So it's going to travel throughout our entire system to get to whatever tissue it needs to go. And then what is going to happen is after we go through that step, the O2 will diffuse again. And it will diffuse from the blood, now that we've arrived down at the tissue, and it will diffuse to the tissue itself. So now we're actually getting to where we need to go. When that oxygen goes from our, here we go, O2, and at this point we are in our blood. When he travels into our tissue, he essentially is going like this. But right in this little spot, when we have the oxygen that has gone to our tissue, what will then happen is that loading and unloading that we talked about. So now, instead of talking about oxygen, the gas that we're going to talk about is going to be CO2. And the reason this process happens is because this right here is going to be cellular respiration. So this will be the Krebs cycle. This will be the conversion where we'll use ATP a lot. That process of cellular respiration is all right here in the middle. We're just going to, for the sake of this class, move past that. So our oxygen becomes CO2 in our tissues. But now we have the CO2. And the CO2 is going to have to diffuse from our blood. And where it will diffuse, CO2 will diffuse from the tissue to our blood. I was a step ahead of the game. So at this point, we have our CO2 in the tissue, and he is going to have to transfer and essentially cross that line to get to CO2 in the blood. So now at this step, we have our carbon dioxide is attached to our blood, and it is sitting in the tips of our toes or whatever tissue it is. So then it's going to follow a system where that CO2 is going to have to get from the tips of our toes back to our lungs. So the way it does that is the CO2 will actually travel in the blood to the lungs. So we were in our tissues, and now we are traveling from the blood all the way up to our lungs. So then when we get to our lungs, we're going to go through a process where we need to get rid of the CO2. So at this point, you will have your CO2 will diffuse. And the CO2 will actually diffuse from the blood to alveoli. So now we've got our CO2, it's in our blood, and it has to pass this little barrier to be our CO2 in the air. And after it does this process, we are now with our carbon dioxide in our air, and it will actually be our CO2 right here, that remember is going to be in our lungs, and then he is going to be expelled out of our mouth this way. And then what you will have is CO2 out in the air. So when we're looking at this entire process, we have our inhalation. We did this entire process. Over here is going to be our exhalation. So this is what happens when you are taking in a breath and exhaling out of a breath. So we kind of followed a breath through this process of inhalation and exhalation. So now to put these 4 steps up here of the respiratory process down here onto what we just drew, it will actually be pretty interesting to see how all that works. So with the process of inhalation, we are taking in oxygen into our lungs. We are bringing that in. If we were to take our notes and look at that, this guy right here is going to be step 1, which was pulmonary ventilation. And if we look back up at step 1 with what pulmonary ventilation is, we said that it was air into our lungs and you were breathing. Air into our lungs, that's exactly what we're doing. So then after that, we go through the process where oxygen diffuses from the alveoli into our blood. This step right here is going to actually be step 2, which was external respiration. So external respiration, up here we defined it as a gas exchange between air and blood in our lungs. So this was in our lungs and we were doing unloading and loading. So we were getting rid of our carbon dioxide, unloading that, and loading oxygen onto our blood. So over here, what are we doing? We are loading oxygen onto our blood. But what are we doing over here with our external respiration? We are loading and we are loading and unloading as well. So look at those guys. So then we go through a process of, after we've exchanged all of our respiratory system, our respiration, we are exchanging gases. Then we go through the process where we said step 3 was transport of gases. So on this side, we are traveling, our oxygen is traveling in our blood to our tissues, and on this side, our carbon dioxide is traveling in the blood to our lungs. So we're still transporting the gases throughout the body. And then the 4th process was internal respiration. And again, at this point, we said respiration was loading and unloading of gases, and here we are loading and unloading the blood to our tissue with our oxygen, and we are loading and unloading our carbon dioxide between our tissue and our blood. So what you've actually done is, with an inhalation and an exhalation of a breath, you have followed all 4 steps of respiration. You've done pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, the transport of gases, and then you've done internal respiration. And you follow that process for oxygen, and then you reverse that process for carbon dioxide, and you go through those same 4 steps. So one way that's really easy to think about it is ventilation, by definition, is going to be our breathing, like we said at the top. You are breathing in and you are breathing out. Whenever you get to respiration, you need to think about loading and unloading of our gases. So this I like to describe when we're doing loading and unloading for external versus internal. So when you are loading and unloading external respiration, you are doing it with the air. Either way, you are doing it with an external part of your body. You are exchanging the gases with the air in and out of your blood. Whereas when you get down to internal respiration, you're still doing loading and unloading, but what you're doing is you are doing it internally between the blood and the tissue. So there is respiration, there's still exchange of gases, there's still loading and unloading of those gases, but you're doing it internally inside your system between the blood and the tissue. So I find those are pretty helpful to kind of understand and keep those in mind. So this is just the overall process of kind of respiration as a nutshell. We're going to break it down in the exercise 37 as well. But right now we're going to switch gears and do our actual anatomical structures. So what allows our body and our system to be able to do this inhalation, exhalation, respiratory process? So we're just going to break it down. We're not going to go into all of the specifics for this, but we're going to kind of break it down a wee bit for our anatomical structures of our respiratory system. We're going to start, and I am not an artist, so we're going to make it work. Woo. It's a very pointed chin, so we're going to fix that. This is going to be my nostrils, my nose, and this is my mouth. So again, I am not an artist, so please bear with me on that. When we're talking about the anatomical structures of the respiratory system, it's broken into two parts. First, you're going to have your upper respiratory structures. So this is essentially going to be areas of your mouth and nose. And then once we get past this, we'll then break down the lower respiratory structures. So the upper respiratory structures, some ones that you need to know are going to be your nostrils, your palate, which is the roof of your mouth. There is a hard palate and a soft. You need to know both of those and where they are. And then we're going to talk about where the pharynx is. So at this particular point, when we are breathing in air, air will come through, well, that's a fun color. Air will come through our nostrils, but air will also come through our mouth. And at the back of our nasal cavity, we're just going to draw it like this, and our oral cavity, they will actually meet. So here's the back of our nose, and here's the back of our mouth. That is not at all anatomically correct, but y'all follow with me. So our nose will dump into the same place where the back of our mouth is. And that is going to be your pharynx. This is essentially where they meet. We call this our throat. And in this season of coronavirus, this is actually where they will partially do some of the oral swabs and testing for cases for coronavirus will actually involve these upper respiratory structures, either going in through the nostrils or sometimes the back of the throat. I have heard of that one as well. So that's the world we're living in. It's actually very apropos for the chapter we're learning right now. So with the pharynx, this is going to be your throat. It's at the back where your nasal cavity and your oral cavity are kind of combine. It does have three sections. The first section is going to be your nasopharynx. This is going to be the top. I'm just going to do an N right here. Nasopharynx. And then you will have the next part of your pharynx will be the oropharynx, named for the oral region of your mouth. So we've got your nose and then your mouth. And then those will translate and go into the laryngopharynx. All the 15-letter words. And that's going to be this guy. And the laryngopharynx is going to start the bottom of your throat. So that is that backside, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Another upper respiratory structure you need to know, at the end of the pharynx, you will have your larynx. So don't get the pharynxes confused with the larynx. The larynx is going to be around the bottom of your chin, and this will actually be where you will also find your epiglottis and where you will find your vocal cords, otherwise known as your vocal folds, because they essentially do look like folded tissue. So around the edge of your larynx, this is where you will find your epiglottis and your vocal cords and your folds. Your epiglottis is going to be a flap of connective tissue, and this tissue will actually separate out two systems, and it will separate out your respiratory tract, which we're going to talk about next, versus your digestive tract. So if you intake air through your mouth, it will eventually follow this process. But if you intake food into your mouth, you do not want your food to travel down this entire process. So your epiglottis will actually cover and make food go down the correct track, whereas your air will go down into the lower respiratory structures. So that's kind of the break between the two. So that's the upper respiratory structures. Now to go into the lower respiratory structures. So we're just going to kind of build on this pathway. My screen will move with me. There we go. So with our lower respiratory structures, this is mainly going to consist of the lungs. There's a little bit more to it than just lungs, but so now that we have gone down this right here with our larynx, we've broken up this system. This perspective right here is from the side, whereas this perspective that we're getting ready to draw is going to be from the front. So it's going to be the anterior view. So coming down this part of your lower respiratory structures, you are going to have a tube like this. Let me redraw that because that's not awesome. A tube, and then he will branch like so. So the first lower respiratory structure is going to be the trachea. So when we have the epiglottis working and functioning correctly, the trachea will only have air moving through it, whereas the trachea, when it has food moving through it, is causing a different host of problems. So with our trachea, this is going to be coming straight from our larynx, epiglottis to our trachea. After our trachea, we also call this our windpipe. It's about 4 inches long, so it's not small. Then we're going to branch into the right and the left main bronchi. So that's going to be this one and this one. So right and left main bronchi. It will actually branch. And then it will go into what we call our lobes. So you will have a right lobe to your lung, and you will have a left lobe to a right side and a left side to your lungs. So the right and the left main bronchi branch and go into each side of the lungs. When we're looking at this part of the lungs is called the apex, and this part of the lung is called the base. Apex is the point, so it was very similar to the heart, where the apex is the point, but remember the heart was upside down, so the base was at the top and the apex was at the bottom. So remember that it's not a direction, it's a description of a point versus more of a flat basal surface. So we've got our right and left main bronchi that are going into each side of the lung. And then these are going to branch into a couple different structures. So I'm not going to be able to draw these super pretty, but if you look in the book, you'll be able to see these. So these branch further into what are called bronchioles. And these bronchioles will then branch even further, like that, into respiratory bronchioles. And then after you get to the respiratory bronchioles, they will then branch even further. And these will branch and be called the alveolar ducts. And then these alveolar ducts will branch into the ends, which are going to be the alveoli. So when we're looking at trachea, the right and left main bronchi, the bronchioles, and the respiratory bronchioles, essentially you're looking at a highway. So remember, air is coming, ooh, wrong color. So remember, air is coming in to our mouth and nose, then it comes down through our trachea, and then it can branch and go down through this pathway. When we get to our right and left main bronchi and our bronchioles, we're essentially going from 285, which is a 6-lane highway, to a side street, which is a 4-lane highway. From that side street, you're then going on a street that is only 2 ways or 2 directions, and then you're going from there into a 1-way street, and then there, all the way at the very end, you will end up in a cul-de-sac. And that's essentially how the respiratory system works. You go from a large highway to a side street, to a small highway, to a side street, to entrance to your neighborhood, and that entrance to your neighborhood into a cul-de-sac. And at the end of the cul-de-sac is your alveoli, and that's where you'll have exchange of gases. So if you do that a lot, and you go from one highway way here into all of these little alveoli sacs that are all over your lungs, you essentially can have lots and lots and lots and lots of gas exchange, because the more alveoli you have, the more surface area you have, the more surface area, the more ability you have exchange of gases. So this is the way that is going to work. When you look at your alveolar ducts underneath the microscope, I'm going to slide to the right a little bit. When you look at these guys underneath the microscope, what you might see is a tube that kind of looks like this, and then you might see this. Or you might see for this. You could see all kinds of things. When you're looking at this, you are looking at a cross section. The way I like to describe this is alveolar ducts and alveoli is a bunch of grapes. So if I have a bunch of grapes who are on a vine like this, and these are all my grapes hanging out on this lovely, delicious vine. Those aren't too bad looking. Essentially, that's what you're doing with your alveoli. This is going to be your alveolar duct. Breaks into those little stems, and then the grape itself is the alveoli. So if you take the grape and you chop it in half, you are essentially seeing, remember, so we're going to take this guy and we're going to chop it in half. If we were to chop it in half, you are looking at the flat surface right here. So you're essentially looking at a grape sliced in half. That's what this is right here. It's a grape sliced in half. This is a grape sliced in half. This is a grape sliced in half. This is obviously a grape sliced in half. So that's what you're kind of looking at. Another way you can think about it is a tennis ball. Whereas if you cut a tennis ball in half and then turn it on its side, you can just see the outside section. That's essentially what you're looking at underneath the slides. So one cool thing about this process with our lower respiratory structures is when we are looking at these guys right here, our trachea all the way to our bronchioles, this right here, there is no exchange of gases. So this part right here, these two sections, or these three structures, trachea, right and left main bronchi, and their bronchioles, these are going to be called your conducting zones. So essentially with these, it is a tube. The tube is making the air travel. The trachea is bringing air in and down into the lungs. The right and left main bronchi are branching the air into the right and left side of the lungs. And then the bronchioles are breaking it down further. So these are conducting zones. They are only moving air through. Whereas once you get to respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and the actually alveoli themselves, this is where you actually are going to get exchange of gases. So these are going to be called respiratory zone structures. So now you can have exchange of gases along this process. The majority of it happens at the end in the alveoli, but you will have some gas exchange at these areas. So it's really cool to think about the conducting zones is literally just going to be conducting things. It's just moving air. There's no exchange of gases. Whereas your respiratory zones are actually going to be where you can have gas exchange. Okay, so one other thing about these lower respiratory structures is what does it look like when you look at them underneath the microscope? We talked about that with alveoli, but I want to break down the types of cells that your trachea and your alveoli are actually lined with. So your trachea is actually lined with, and this is going to flash back to first semester, these are ciliated, mucus secreting, pseudostratified, columnar epithelium. So if that doesn't ring a bell, go back and look at first semester material. So essentially, let's do it so it's consistent. If this is my trachea coming down through the bottom of my throat into my lungs, what we're saying is lining the edge of these guys right here, lining the edge of the trachea, there will be ciliated mucus-secreting pseudostratified columnar epithelial cells. The reason they are ciliated is because there are tiny little cilia that will stick out of these cells. And this cilia will then produce a mucus. And after it produces that mucus essentially will be moved up and down the lining of your trachea. So that way, if you breathe in anything that has funky something in it, the mucus will grab it in your trachea, and that cilia will move that little blob of mucus up and out. So that way you're not keeping in anything into your lungs that your body does not need. If you've ever been super sick with a really, really bad chest cold and they tell you to take an expectorant essentially will target this, and it will target the creation of more mucus, and it will cause that mucus to come up and out of your system, bringing the things with it that your body does not need, which is why it is disgusting as all get out. But when you are hacking up, for lack of a better word, gunk out of your lungs and it's got that green tint to it, what you're doing is actually getting out the mucus, and that mucus is carrying with it pieces of wastes, things you don't need, items from the air, and it's trying to get it germs, get it out of your system. So an expectorant is actually exacerbating that system in a good way, and it kind of makes it worse for a minute, but what you're really doing is trying to get that stuff out of your system. So that's really, really important. Another thing about your trachea is this is a tube that goes all the way down your throat, but it is going to be it was going to be lined with C-shaped cartilage. So this C-shaped cartilage looks like this. So when we actually look at this from the front with this C-shaped cartilage, you see this from the front. When you look at it from the side, you will also see the C-shaped cartilage. But when you look at it from the back, essentially it will then be on the sides, but it will be open. So this C-shaped cartilage is going to be incomplete on the posterior. And the reason it is incomplete on the posterior is because in your throat, that's where we are, here's your trachea. Right behind it, if this is anterior, this is going to be posterior. Right behind it, you have another tube. Right behind it. This tube right here is your esophagus. So this is where the food will go. So you want air to come down here, and you want food to go down here. But if you were to eat a really, really, really big piece of food that got stuck in your esophagus and made that esophagus expand, because that sometimes happens, and this is what can happen a lot for people who do not adequately chew their food. This is why we have our C-shaped trachea. The food will go down, and if you have a really large bulge of food, you can see how it actually pops into our esophagus, into our trachea. Well, we don't want that to happen because we want to be able to breathe. So the way that your body solves for this is they don't let that happen. So with your trachea having this C C-shaped, and again, this is going to be from the side, both of these pictures. If we have this C-shaped cartilage, it's going to maintain the integrity of this tube. So that way when food comes in and you have a big ball of food, these do not allow it to actually push into it. So it could try, but it is not allowed to actually happen. So that maintains the integrity of the structure of the trachea ourselves. The other reason you will have this, so this was the first reason why you have an incomplete on the posterior. So the first reason is going to be it allows for the connection between the esophagus and the what's it called? Trachea to work. It allows for the integrity of the esophagus and the trachea to work together. But it also will keep the trachea from collapsing. So it will reinforce the trachea. The reason we need to reinforce the trachea is because when we are talking about gas, carbon dioxide and oxygen, when we're talking about gases, you will automatically be talking about pressure. So when you put gas into your tire, what you do is you measure the pressure in your tire. So gas and pressure go together. So when we have gas entering our trachea, you could also have pressure. And so the C-shaped cartilage allows for your pressure, allows for the pressure due to the gas to not collapse your trachea, because if you collapse your trachea, then you're not getting any air into your lungs, and therefore you are not being able to go through the process of respiration and get any kind of gas exchange, any kind of cellular respiration, and essentially at the end of the day, no metabolism, no bodily functions. And that is a problem. So that's actually kind of what happens with a choking, where you cannot get air in.